Most neighborhoods, at least as we knew them, disappear into the past as a fading blur of incremental change. But the obliteration of the West End by urban renewal about 60 years ago left a vivid impression of a diverse working class neighborhood pitted against the city's power brokers. It's a story you can explore in exhibits and programs offered by the West End Museum, not only about the fate of a single neighborhood, but about the fundamental equation of life in a city. To tell us what's happening this summer at the museum is its director, Sebastian Belfanti. Thank you very much for being with us, Sebastian.
Thanks for having me.
Sebastian, for people who haven't been introduced to the West End, I mean, a lot of people can tell you where the North End is because they'll come up with this postcard picture of Hanover Street. But the West End, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, so the West End's, it's sort of an in-between neighborhood in a lot of ways. Its north boundary with the North End is North Washington Street. It continues down on Sudbury along the Haymarket Garage, which obviously is coming down now, and then down along Cambridge Street to the water. But the original boundaries, which are the area we represent, it's a little different. So it actually originally cut Pemberton Square and the State House in half, and then continued on Pinckney Street and included the north slope of Beacon Hill. So our museum represents both the north slope and the modern day West End, although the current West End ends at Cambridge Street.
You know, lots of neighborhoods and demographic enclaves have come and gone. What makes the West End special?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a dynamic neighborhood. I think one of the most changing places, not just in Boston, but in any city in the US. It started as actually farmland up until the Revolutionary War, was founded by African Americans who were then the pioneers of the abolitionist movement. It became a very wealthy neighborhood filled with buildings built by Charles Bulfinch, America's first architect, and then transitioned to being the most diverse neighborhood in Boston's history, representing some 23 ethnicities. It contained 7 churches, I believe 14 synagogues, just an incredible number of different cultures. And then in 1958 to 1960, as you mentioned, it was zoned as an urban renewal project, actually 3 urban renewal projects, and torn down. The core of the neighborhood was torn down entirely. Today, there are only 12 buildings left standing from that period. Since then, it's grown as Charles River Park and is obviously a populated area again. But
well, when that urban renewal plan was taking shape, I think the dominating narrative in Boston was that the city has to shake off the blight, and this is a case of blight that had to go. How do people in the neighborhood feel about that?
I mean, it's a tough history, I think, for people who are living here now. People at the time certainly wouldn't have agreed with that assessment. You know, again, you have to understand that most of the quote unquote tenements in the West End, they were pretty fancy houses that had been built for Boston's wealthiest citizens and then converted into tenements. So they were really nice quality buildings. Unlike the North End, when it went through its renewal phase to stable, it didn't really require that kind of stabilization of structures and stuff. The buildings were in good shape, at least they were until city officials started encouraging people not to maintain them. And then it did quickly go downhill. So in about the 10 years preceding urban renewal, the city slowly kind of encouraged people to leave spaces vacant, to not maintain structures. And then by the time the neighborhood was torn down, it had become kind of what people were claiming it was, but it certainly wasn't that way naturally.
These days downtown, you see more and more places where people actually live. But you know, you don't see them outside except in certain special places like the Greenway or Hanover Street or along the waterfront. But when I look at pictures of the West End, they're outside everywhere. I mean, there's so much life in so many streets, people playing ball, people shopping, people hanging the laundry up. What's the difference here we're talking about?
Yeah, you know, Jane Jacobs would call that kind of like eyes on the street, right? It's a kind of culture and community that focuses on interactive spaces and community spaces. I think just the nature of those neighborhoods and the way that people just interacted with their spaces, right? They weren't commuting very far, especially in the West End. Many people lived, worked, ate, everything within that unit, part of why the city wanted it to go, actually. And because of that, it was just this really dynamic space. The schools were integrated. There were, again, a lot of schools in the neighborhood. So everyone knew each other, even if you went to a different church and went to a different, or synagogue, went to a different grocery store, ate different foods. Like your kids were going to the same schools, and you may have lived in a building with or adjacent to families with very different cultures. So we hear a lot of stories about people having dinner with someone who has a very different background from them, a group of someone whose background is, I don't know, Lithuanian Jewish, and is having weekly dinners with their African American neighbors. It's just not a dynamic that we're used to, I think, in the modern world, as neighborhoods have become more properly segregated as opposed to micro-segregated, which is the technical term for.
One relic of that I was able to spot on your website was from a settlement house, the West End house,
Yes.
the photo of the basketball team, and who's there in the back? Leonard Nimoy.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, Nimoy is one of a handful of really talented, creative people who came out of the neighborhood. Interestingly and somewhat uniquely, settlement houses in the West End, and there were a bunch of them as well, kind of developed past their sort of admittedly sort of racist roots in Americanization and became very dynamic community centers. So some really famous people like Ruth Roman and Leonard Nimoy, as well as Hyman Bloom, who's a very well-known local artist, if you're into that kind of thing, is really got their starts, learned how to do acting, learned how to paint, whatever, at these spaces. They're actually, our current exhibit on the Elizabeth Peabody House gets into how at the EPH, the Elizabeth Peabody House, the students were, or well, not really students, but participants, boys and girls were taught STEM education. You can imagine how rare that would have been in the 1920s and 30s. But it was just a much more kind of equal society for it. It developed that way, right? I mean, it happens. And when you have a lot of people who are all coming in working towards the same basic goal of an economic stability and moving up and together, right? I think that really fostered a sense of community that was not, I won't say unique, but somewhat unique to the neighborhood in the time.
Sebastian, we're talking about things that are not there anymore, but you have walking tours.
Yes.
What can people channel from the old West End going on these walks?
Sure. So we do a variety of tours. On June 26th, we'll do one on canals. That's very specific. So you'll walk down, Canal Street, cross the Charles, and continue on in Charlestown and into Somerville, following the Middlesex Canal, which was kind of a economic, artery for Boston in its very early days. We do a lot of transportation history at the museum because the West End was a real hub for that. For the sort of general history tours, like ones that I will lead on June 19th, July 1st, July 9th, and July 14th, those, so a lot of what we're looking at is where things used to be, right? There's no question. There are a handful of buildings remaining, as I believe I said, about 12, plus Beacon Hill and the Bullfinch Triangle, which are both better preserved. And there's a lot of just really dynamic stories and interesting kind of sites in the neighborhood. One kind of very different one that I like to use often is the Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge. Both of those bridges are gone, but we can look at the ones that have replaced them. And they're really important. They're actually critical to defining modern contract law. So, even for you or I, Chris, when we sign a contract to do our jobs, right? The basic format of those agreements was set mostly by legal cases in Boston in the early 1800s, and almost all of those actually were in the West End. There's three major cases. One was argued by John Quincy Adams, and the other by Daniel Webster. So.
Correct me if I'm mistaken about this, but isn't there one surviving old building that you can still see, maybe see it at night where it looks like a mirage?
Yeah, 42 Lamasny. It's right across from the museum. That's commonly called the last tenement. That it has an interesting story. It's almost gone down 3 or 4 times. It actually used to be a block of 3 up until like the 90s, but it's just alone now. Still occupied. I believe there are 4 units in there, yeah, it's a really unique little structure. It was just between 2 different project areas, so it just keeps getting somehow ignored in this project and that project, and it's survived. I think it's a really special place. Everyone seems to recognize it immediately, even if you don't know anything else about it. I went to a Celtics game, I went to a Bruins game, I saw that weird little building there. What's up with that, right? It's very interesting, and there were a lot of rumors about it, which mostly unfounded. But
by the way, Sebastian, if people want some more details to know when and what's happening, you've got a website they can go to?
Yeah, thewestendmuseum.org, nice and easy, as exactly our name. The at the beginning is of course important, but yeah.
Well, thank you very much for taking us on this preview of a tour.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
From the West End Museum, Sebastian Belfanti. We'll have more news in just a moment.